All right, welcome to the Security Weekly News Wrap-Up for the week of 16 October 2022. It's episode 249. We've got SBOMs save the world, Elon, being Elon, cut cables in Europe, biometric lawsuits, SIM swappers are back, I don't think they ever left, tracking pixels, and fake LinkedIn account, along with show wrap-ups on this edition of the Security Weekly News.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News.
Managing and protecting the world's grueling number of endpoints, enabling Tanium's customers to see, control, and protect every endpoint everywhere. Tanium's mission is to provide certainty in uncertain times with the industry's only converged endpoint management. Trusted by the U.S. military and the majority of the Fortune 100 today, Tanium helps manage and protect nearly 30 million endpoints. Tanium, the power of certainty. Visit securityweekly.com/Tanium to learn more. Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cyber criminals are hiding in the conversation. Cyber criminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of the 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection by going and getting your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. All right, I'm Doug White, and this is the Security Weekly News Wrap-Up Show, episode 249. This week on Application Security Weekly number 216, John and Mike had Jason Rekla on the show, and Jason is the Director of Information Security, Security Operations, and Compliance at NVIDIA. The discussion was about how accelerated AI is used at NVIDIA, that's a product too, is used at NVIDIA to reduce the overall number of cybersecurity events a great deal. As we all know, dealing when your monitoring software generates 100 million events a day, it's kind of hard to go through them all. So trying to reduce that sort of surface that had to be reviewed by the human side of the equation. In the second segment, the AppSec News. On Business Security Weekly number 281, Matt, Josh, and Tyler had my favorite thing on Business Security Weekly, which is the Security Weekly Index. That is their review of investments in cyberspace, new companies, companies that have been in their portfolio for years. So if you are an investor, that's definitely a great segment to keep up with. I know I always look forward to it because I can revise my pathetic little portfolio that I have as for fun. In the second segment, the leadership and communication news. On Enterprise Security Weekly 293, Martin Roche, the CEO of Netography, was on, and Martin was if you didn't know this, Martin was the original author of Snort and was the founder of SourceFire. And of course, I see, author of Snort. Snort's near and dear to my heart, and I've set up so many Snort systems for people. Very cool product that I enjoyed building out a lot. But the segment on there was about ways to try and deal. It wasn't so much about Snort, but it was about legacy networks and how you migrate things to the cloud. In particular, they were talking about how the current state of networking is just sort of somewhere in the middle. Most people are not fully in the cloud or fully on-prem, but they're somewhere between that, and so they're sort of stuck in this fog, as they call it. And they basically were talking about why he built Snort and how that was very similar to what's going on right now. So it's a cool segment. In the second segment, Edward Wu, the senior principal data scientist at ExtraHop, was on, and Edward was on to talk about deployment approaches and scenarios which would facilitate gathering and using network data in cloud environments. So again, that same kind of problem. And in the third segment, the enterprise security news. On the Security Weekly News, number 248, Jason talked about a new ransomware cartel that might be REvil. It's probably REvil. It sounds like REvil, even though REvil shut down. But I've never known if it's REvil or REvil, but whatever it is. they shut down, but just because you shut down a ransomware cartel doesn't mean all the members suddenly say, "Oh, that's it. I'm going to move to an asteroid and never be seen again." So it might be REvil. On Paul's Security Weekly number 760. First up was a very fun security news segment. We had a really good time talking about all sorts of things, and primarily about things that do not work. So in fact, people were talking about that the episode should be called Things That Don't Work. But the whole day on Wednesday this week was Devo Day for the company, and they recorded pretty much all day. I think they were recording. So there were webcasts and other things that they did, and then they aired 2 recorded segments after the news show. In the first of those segments, Michael Mice, the associate CISO for University of Kansas Health System, was on to talk about the history of warfare and how the history of warfare influenced cybercrime, and how we might want to shift some of our ways that we deal with cybercrime to what he called a victory mindset. In the third segment of the evening, Christopher Crowley, the subject matter expert at Montance LLC, was on, and Chris was on talking about SOC training and development best practices. So a full day of activity here at Security Weekly on last Wednesday. My thread of the week came right out of some of the conversation that we had on Security Weekly News this week about SBOMs. And I certainly, when I first saw this legislation come out that from the United States government, that they were going to require this software bill of materials to be put on software, I guess I thought it was a good idea, and I still think it's an interesting idea. But I think where it's kind of gotten to now is the danger of believing in it too much. This is why, to me, it becomes a threat. We spent some time talking about the different SBOM rules, and the article that Paul was using on the show was talking about nutrition labels, and they were sort of comparing SBOMs to nutrition labels. And it really isn't that. And we sort of had that conversation, and I certainly agreed with that position. I mean, it is in the same realm of existence, so it's not just a completely silly analogy. But the idea that this SBOM about software is the same thing as a nutrition label is just not quite the same thing. I mean, I think the biggest issue in the SBOM thing is that there's a whole set of other dimensions to software that doesn't exist in food, right? I mean, if you buy a Twinkie, it's got a list of ingredients on the side, and that list of ingredients is pretty static because they took the Twinkie. Theoretically, these are the things they used to make it, and they wrapped it up in a wrapper, and it's going to stay that way for until after the fall of civilization, because Twinkies are indestructible apparently. So that wheat, weasel grease, owl oil, red dye number 7, and whatever else is used to extrude those things, because I always imagined they were extruded. I know they're not, but I always just imagine sort of a tube coming down, and there's this kind of like sound, and then this Twinkie kind of oozes out the end of it. Yeah, maybe it twitches a little bit. Maybe those are alien eggs. I'm not sure. And they may have alien eggs in them. I'm not sure. I'm sorry, Twinkies. Everybody loves Twinkies, so you can bash on them a little bit. But, once that happens, it's static. The wheat and the owl grease are static. And so no matter how much is there, but the SBOM is billed, get it, as a kind of solution to supply chain problems. And that's where I start to sort of have an issue with it. I mean, a piece of software is not the same thing as a Twinkie. There's a lot of ingredients in software, absolutely. But even on the Twinkie, if the Twinkie uses 240 grams of ground owl meat or something to be made, software uses APIs, libraries, code, and stuff that goes up and down the supply chain. So it's really more like a need. If you wanted to do this, you'd have to track that ground owl paste all the way back to where the owl paste came from, because there's components in the owl paste too, right? And you don't know what those are, and so they can literally just list ground owl on the side of the package, and that's the end with a nutrition label. But you really need to know what went into the ground owl, what were its bones made of, what were and on and on and on. So you really need an SBOM then for each library or API or whatever is included in that code. And I mean, some of those libraries and APIs have libraries and APIs in them. Little fleas have little fleas on their backs to bite them kind of stuff. And it's just sort of this endless cycle all the way back. So now you got a big pile of documents that starts to look like, a border crossing documents for the Soviet Union or something. And you're just trying to describe what's in that copy of Angry Birds. And then even then, within that piece of software, there's versioning. So it may or may not be very static, and over time it very well may change. So if your copy of Angry Birds was compiled with version 1.4.17 of Owl Grinder, and why am I on this today? I've got Owl Grease, Owl Grinder, Owl Oil, and Ground Owl. I don't know. Sorry, Owl. I have owls at my house, and so maybe that's why it's just slipping over in. But anyway, if my version was not compiled with the same version as your version, which is possible, suddenly there's 2 different SBOMs just for each different copy of Angry Birds. So, I mean, you start thinking about Linux kernels. Well, they're all over the place. And there's stable kernels, there's unstable kernels, there's Arch, there's all this stuff, and all of it may be used in the process. And I mean, don't even get me started on hardware, because that could affect these things as well, right? I mean, if the local system had firmware infections at ring 0 and is injecting things into the software that were compiled locally, I don't know. Sam called this Minority Report stuff on Security Weekly on Wednesday, and I pretty much was, I think everybody agreed with him. I mean, and if you don't know, Minority Report was a Philip K. Dick novel about being able to predict crimes, so you predict somebody's going to commit a murder, and then they go arrest you in advance of that happening. Yeah, so it may just not be enough to just list the ingredients in software. And, it might have to be some kind of almost active dynamic stamp or something that reflects the state at the moment that software was actually compiled, if it's actually going to do you any good. So it almost have to be part of the compile process. And of course, this doesn't even talk about scripts and things. And I am certainly not opposed to the SBOM idea in general. I like it. When I first heard it, I liked it. But I worry that all of a sudden it's going to be one of those panaceas that come out and it turns into some kind of stamp of approval or a scarlet letter just because it lists Owl Grinder app or Owl Grinder API on the SBOM. So, this has Owl Grinder API in it, don't use it. And I mean, maybe that's not even relevant. Maybe it was patched, whatever. Owl Grinder version 2 is fine, but version 1.3 is not so fine. And version 1.57 is right out. So which is it? And so, see SBOM documentation page 5001 in volume 9 for reference materials. And all of a sudden, it becomes almost useless. But again, I think it is a move forward. It may lead somewhere. But please, especially if you're on these committees and groups that try to, establish whether these things are useful or not, please use some caution in just how much faith you put in the SBOM idea. I mean, you read the ingredients on Twinkies, right? But do you know what it means? Like, what is polysorbate 60 anyway? That actually is a Twinkie ingredient. And where did polysorbate 60 come from? Is it being squeezed out of like slugs somewhere in a factory, or is it like something they scrape off of walls? I don't know what polysorbate 60 is. Was it grown? Was it free range? Or did they get it from Mr. Harris's slightly unusual esters and polymers? Yeah, don't even get me started on the versioning. I mean, was that corn syrup in that Twinkie 34 years old and drained out of an old silo that had been slated for destruction? No, of course not. No way companies would ever use tainted ingredients to save money. Never. Not a chance. I'm kind of hungry, actually. I could eat. Yeah. All right, and now the news. Zscaler reported they were having to make routing adjustments to mitigate the impact of a severed cable in France yesterday, which doesn't sound like a big deal, right? I mean, I first saw it, I was like, okay, how unfortunate. But apparently at 20:30 UTC, which is like 4:30 in the afternoon in New York, a cable was cut. And there was a lot of like different articles about this. Some of them said it was in the ocean, but later it turned out it was not. But it didn't just bring down some features in Marseille. It actually brought down like the whole internet. Well, not completely, but it had an impact on the entire internet. It says the cable is the key to subsea connectivity in Europe, Asia, and the United States. And after it was cut, packet losses and latency went up for a lot of sites. Now, some of this is not because that cable actually connects you to the United States, but because of apps. You're running things that are embedded on websites and whatnot that are hosted abroad. So they actually, this is the nature of the internet now, this sort of gestalt big glob. But by 2300 UTC, it was confirmed that 3 links, the Marseille Lyon and Marseille Milano and Marseille Barcelona, were all down. So however they got cut. One of the links was restored, and there's a couple of things in this article that make you start asking those kind of conspiracy type questions, right? I mean, by 1 o'clock this morning, it says it was all restored, and the story says the others were restored. But the time they gave, which was like 1830, hadn't even happened yet, which, so now it's like, is it the Illuminati? But apparently at the very same time this happened, a cable was also cut in the Shetland Islands, which is like north of Scotland. It's like out in the North Sea. And it cut off the Shetland Islands from internet access. And apparently they rely on that pretty heavily for emergency services and whatnot. There's like 23,000 people live in the Shetland Islands. But various organizations said the cable damages were caused by fishing boats. I was like, what? And the one cable in Marseille was not actually in the water. Initially, they said it was in the water, but it wasn't in the water. So how did a fishing boat cut the cable? I was rather confused by that. I thought, this is a little weird. And initially, the article I was reading, and it had a correction attached to it. Initially, they said it was possibly an act of sabotage. But then they revised the article to say it was not sabotage. They said there was no evidence at all to indicate that it was sabotage, even though there were articles saying that it may have been, but they all changed it. So, I don't know. There was a lot of fishy stuff. Get that? Yeah, there was a lot of fishy stuff about undersea cables that were actually on land when they initially reported that it was a undersea cable, and then it was cut by a fishing boat, and then all of a sudden they came back and said, well, that main cable was not undersea, it was actually on land, and it was actually 3 cables, and they never did correct about the fishing boats. So I don't know. I mean, read this and see what you think. It was very, to me, it was like, could it be like Russian, frogmen or whatever you call those? I don't know. I don't want to start conspiracies. Apparently they were trying to, but we gave up on that. Well, Texas is suing Google again for being in violation of the Texas Biometric Privacy Act. The act requires companies to get a user's consent if they're collecting any sort of biometric data about those users. And this act has been around for more than a decade. So I honestly didn't even know about it, but I don't really follow what they're doing in Texas. So, but they had this act, and they claimed that Google has been collecting biometric data from users since 2015, and that they use this information for commercial ends. Imagine that. So, just as some reference point, Google was fined $60 million in August for collecting and using location data for 2 years in Australia. I don't know if that was Australian dollars or U.S. dollars. It just had a dollar sign on it. France fined Google 170 million, I presume, euros for hiding tracking cookie rejection options behind multiple clicks. They love that. It's like really hard to get to that thing to reject all those cookie options. And Google was fined $2.72 billion with a B dollars for rigging search results. $1.7 billion with a B for anti-competitive practices in online advertising, 220 million euros for favoring its service over others, and so, to the disadvantage of their competitors, 11.3 million for aggressive data collection, and on and on. Now, Google's a massive company, and of course, massive companies are sued every day, for all sorts of things. But, for a company who used the motto, "Don't be evil," I mean, wasn't that one of their original mottos, like "Don't be evil"? Well, Emperor Palpatine's campaign slogan was "For the children," so who knows? Docker is raising their prices by 28% for team users and 14% for business users after the 27th of October. So it's also going to start limiting the size of your team account to 100 users. So you'll only be able to have 100 separate users in that team account, which means that a lot of smaller organizations who use Docker will be forced into the more expensive business subscription, which is about 3 times the cost of the team subscription. Now, apparently, according to this article, you can get a 30% discount off of a business license account if you are an existing team customer. So be sure before you get pushed into this that you go out and take advantage of that discount if you're being forced down that road. About half of Docker's users are free accounts, which are subsidized by the paying customers, but hopefully you read the licensing agreement so you know that if you're embedding Dockers into commercial products or whatever, you have to be an actual licensed paying customer. So if you're using Docker, you may want to review your situation pretty fast because that's it's coming up in like 6 days. But a lot of times switching platforms is not something you just decide to do. The sweet smell of inelasticity of demand in the morning. Yeah. Well, good old SIM swaps. Though I always thought SIM swaps was one of the most terrifying things. It's something you can't do much about. It relies on human foibles. And all that kind of comes around to haunt me because I'm thinking I have a SIM card. There's people trying to get, access to these things. But Verizon notified prepaid users that their accounts had been compromised. So theoretically, if you were compromised, you've already been notified. But it was all done with SIM swapping. If you don't remember, SIM swapping is where somebody basically fakes the SIM card. So every cell phone has a SIM card in it that identifies it. And for somebody to fake this, they have to take some actions. That basically what they do is they have to get a copy of your SIM card, and they typically do that with basically social engineering or bribery. So they go into a place that has the access to these kind of things, and they create a new SIM card, by saying, "Oh, I lost my phone. Can you help me?" Blah blah blah. Or they just walk in and say, "Here's €100. Can you give me a fake SIM card that's got this number on it?" Once they do that, they kind of have access to a lot of stuff your phone has access to. Because, they can really use your phone in lieu of you because they just plug this in. Pretty scary stuff. There was a Pulse Security Weekly about a year ago. I think it was I looked it up at the end of this, and I know I said which episode it was. I think it was in July of 2021. That was really, really frightening. But, basically the hijack in this case allowed SIM swappers to receive one-time codes that were being sent by multi-factor so that they could reset passwords. Because, if you go and you say, I want to reset my password, and it says we're going to send you a code, and the code comes into your phone, and then you type the code back in, that's multi-factor. Well, with a SIM swap, they can actually intercept these codes, which means they can reset your password. So that would be pretty bad. The notice from Verizon said, quote, using the last 4 digits of your credit card information, the third party was able to gain access to your Verizon account and processed an unauthorized SIM card change on the prepaid line. That seems pretty strange. Again, is it a story that was kind of like, how did they do that? Maybe Verizon, like if you can read them the last 4 digits of the SIM card, they'll convert it. I don't know. It seems like a problem. But they did not clarify how the last 4 digits of the card were accessed and how that could be used to create a SIM swap. And apparently, they were asking Verizon to respond, but they did not get a response. Reputedly, all the victims have been notified. But the SIM swapping episode, here it is. The SIM swapping episode of Pulse Security Weekly was number 701, and it was from July 2021 with Hasiba 1. It was a cool episode. I was on it. So you love that. But if you are interested in SIM swapping or hearing a lot more horror stories about it from Hasiba 1, check that out too. Now, I love it when companies try to justify what they're doing, because they think we're helping you, when they're really just tracking you and selling your information. That's usually what they're doing. Advocate Aurora Health advised 3 million users this week that their protected health information had been exposed to Facebook or Google, or probably both. Why? Well, they were putting a tracking pixel, a huge misnomer in my opinion, but they were putting a tracking pixel on their MyChart and LiveWell websites, and they used a tracking pixel provided by a third party. Now, I will say that originally a tracking pixel could be an actual pixel. So there was a case where people were putting pixels on web pages that were literally, you could see if that pixel turned up again. It was in a file, actually. and it wasn't really a pixel, I guess, but it was, you could see if that thing was in a file later, so you could tell where a file came from. So it was like kind of putting an invisible tracking stamp. But most of these modern tracking pixels are basically just lines of HTML code. And in this case, they used a third party to provide this. Many healthcare providers in the United States do this very thing. They use tracking pixels as well for your convenience. The tracking pixel was built by a third party, and it may have exposed IP addresses, appointment information, procedure types, as well as insurance details and so forth to another party who had access to it. So, basically, these tracking pixels were just lines of HTML code that were tracking user behavior and data and reporting it back. And it's a very common term in marketing, and there's different types of them and so forth. Probably ought to be illegal. Or at least require your, express permission to be used on a page to alert you that there's tracking pixels on the page. But it's not, I don't think. So, that's the way it goes. LinkedIn is apparently trying to reduce the number of bots on the platform. Thank you, LinkedIn. And an odd thing happened when they started this process. About half the accounts that listed Apple as the employer back in October were deleted. Amazon on October 9th showed 1.3 million accounts as being people that were employed by Amazon. And on the 10th of October, that number dropped to 839,000. Wow. So a lot of LinkedIn users are not real users, as if you didn't know that. But I wonder if I maybe shouldn't have given that nice lady my bank account information so they could hire me as a consultant for a whole lot of money. I mean, I don't know about you, but I get these, you get a lot of bot-generated stuff on LinkedIn all the time, asking to be your friend, and you say, well, I might as well, and you say, okay, and then immediately it starts throwing up sales information to you or whatever. Be careful out there. And finally, Elon. Still no free Tesla X for me, so I'm going to go keep telling the truth. Elon said that, and so, anytime you start with Elon said, it's going to be good. Elon said he was going to marry Ye. No, that's not true. Elon said that if the Twitter deal goes through, 75% of the staff will be fired immediately. So that would be about 7,500 people at Twitter. Now, to be fair, Twitter had already said they were going to reduce payroll drastically by $800 million before the end of 2023, and that would represent about a 25% reduction in the total workforce at Twitter. That was in a Washington Post report. So guess why Twitter, who is apparently not making as much money as they might like, was pretty happy to see a really sweet $44 billion with a B dollar offer from Elon Musk for the whole shebang. Edwin Chen, who was formerly, so it's important to note the word formerly, in charge of the spam and health metrics at Twitter, said that the layoffs were very likely necessary that Twitter was proposing, but that the massive cuts proposed by everyone's favorite billionaire were, quote, unimaginable and, quote, would put all Twitter users at risk. Twitter sent out notes to all employees saying that, they didn't know what Elon was up to. They couldn't confirm any sort of plan, blah, blah, blah. The deal between Musk and Twitter, which has gone back and forth, it's on again, it's off again, it's double, it's half, and on and on and on, is reputed to close on the 28th of October. And while some firms in the industry value Twitter at only $10 to $12 billion, and once again, Elon said, so anything that starts with that, it's going to be good. Elon said on Wednesday at an earnings call that they were obviously overpaying for this. So who knows what's going to happen? It's pretty expensive bullhorn, in my opinion, so that Elon can get what he wants to say out there. But, that's the wrap up for the week of 16 October 2022. I'm Doug White. See you next week. Play me off, boys.